A 12-year-old was killed after a grenade likely bought at an antique mall exploded. A 12-year-old in Virginia was killed by an exploding grenade investigators believe was bought from an antique mall in North Carolina. And now authorities are warning others may have been sold and could be live. The grenades were thought to be chemically inactive Mk2 grenades, a style used during World War II. According to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives (ATF), the child was killed on December 23 by an exploding grenade that ATF believes was bought on June 13 from the Fancy Flea Antique Mall in Charlotte. CNN has reached out to the antique mall but has not heard back. When the grenade was sold, the agency said the vendor and buyer didn't believe grenades to be functioning or hazardous. ATF asks others who may have bought a grenade from the same shop to contact them. Out of concern that the grenades purchased from the vendor may contain live explosives and could be hazardous to the public, this wouldn't be the first time a grenade believed to be inert was found and proved to be live. In December 2019, also in North Carolina, a live grenade was found inside a donated dresser at the Habitat Restore in Durham. The volunteer who found it removed it from the building and law enforcement was called. No injuries were reported. Parlor may be gone for now. That won't stop the calls to violence. Online Parlor all but vanished from the internet this week. Major tech platforms, including Apple and Amazon, booted the social network, popular with the far right for what the company said was a failure to moderate incitement and violent rhetoric on its service that contributed to last week's deadly Capitol riots. But that hasn't stopped angry Trump supporters from seeking out other digital gathering spaces, in what may now become a game of extremism whack-a-mole. Multiple alternatives have already claimed to have experienced a surge in sign-ups. The rush to find substitutes amid Parler's apparent demise at this time shows that deplatforming can succeed at sidelining extremism and driving it further out of the mainstream. Parler was already a tiny fraction of the size of larger platforms like Facebook and Twitter, and the alternatives may be smaller still. Parler didn't immediately respond to a request for comment. But this push to deplatform won't eliminate extremism entirely, according to experts who study extremism and online social movements, although these are important actions to have taken. It would be foolish to think this has solved everything, said Shannon McGregor, an assistant professor at the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill who studies the role of social media in politics. That's because, McGregor said, many of Parler's most extreme users are likely to have been connected already on other, similar platforms even before Parler was taken down. Deplatforming certainly takes some wind out of the sails and makes it harder to organize on the same scale. But there's no reason to suspect this was the only place these people are connected, McGregor said, even as Parler sued Amazon in federal court Monday over its decision to cut off service. Calls for violence continued on more loosely moderated forums such as 4chan, with at least one thread reviewed by CNN Business floating the idea of physical attacks on tech company data centers. 4chan didn't immediately respond to a request for comment. Meanwhile, other alternative social networks appear to be benefiting from Parler's takedown. One post in a channel affiliated with the Proud Boys, a group whose members participated in the riot at the Capitol building, on the messaging app Telegram claimed that Telegram has now received tens of thousands of new users seeking refuge from Parler. Telegram didn't immediately respond to a request for comment, but the app has surged to the number 2 spot on Apple's own top charts. Telegram and Signal, an encrypted messaging app, went from tens of thousands of downloads on January 7 to hundreds of thousands of downloads over the weekend, according to data from the app metrics firm Apptopia. Other apps, including MeWe, a social networking app, have also experienced explosive growth over the weekend, Apptopia said. In the first week of 2021, MeWe was being downloaded a little more than 9,000 times a day in the U.S. But on January 8, the day President Donald Trump was banned from Twitter, that number jumped to more than 13,000 and hit 39,000 by the end of January 9. A similar pattern played out with apps for conservative television networks Newsmax and OANN, according to Apptopia. There may be other confounding explanations for the increase in these apps' popularity. Tesla CEO Elon Musk recently endorsed the use of Signal, while a WhatsApp notification about how the app handles user data may have also driven some to embrace alternatives. But those events predated Trump's Twitter ban and Parler's deplatforming. Both apps have been breaking downloads records for themselves since Saturday, said Adam Blacker, Apptopia's VP of Insights. Gab, another platform beloved by some conservatives, said it's added additional capacity after it claimed to have gained more users in a single weekend than in its first 2 years of existence. Gab itself was banned from platforms including Apple and Google's app stores, as well as various payment processors, after it was reported that the suspected shooter behind 2018's Pittsburgh synagogue massacre had maintained a profile on the app and expressed virulently anti-Semitic views. At the time, Gab said it had been unfairly smeared and was under attack for defending free speech. Gab bills itself as the free speech social network. It has boasted of having self-built much of the infrastructure it now operates upon, making it theoretically immune from what happened to Parler. In a post on Gab Monday, CEO Andrew Torbus said a service is seeing roughly the population of Boston joining the site every 24 hours, and warned those posting awful threats that Gab cooperates with law enforcement subpoenas. If abusing our site is your idea of a fun time, you should think twice, Torba wrote. On Monday, Parler's lawsuit claimed that being cut off by Amazon Web Services would spell the nascent platform's death knell. The service, which launched in 2018 and attracted prominent figures in the Republican Party like Sens. Ted Cruz and Rand Paul, portrayed itself as an alternative to Facebook and Twitter that would be far more expansive in its interpretation of free speech. That same principle, however, appears to be what got the company into hot water with Apple, Google and Amazon. In a statement Monday evening, Amazon said the lawsuit has no merit and that Parler had violated its terms of service because of the violent content and incitement found on its site. We made our concerns known to Parler over a number of weeks, and during that time we saw a significant increase in this type of dangerous content, not a decrease, which led to our suspension of their services Sunday evening, Amazon said. Parler claimed in its lawsuit that after Amazon flagged numerous examples of violent content over the last few days, Parler had removed everything AWS had brought to its attention and more, while alleged hateful posts on other social networks did not result in Amazon sanctions. In some ways, the notoriety associated with Parler is a distraction, according to Graham Brookie, director of the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. Some of the groups that descended on the Capitol last week may have organized to some extent on Parler, but many have long been part of other online communities that predate Parler entirely. Armed militia groups, he said, have for years organized on military forums and chat rooms. There's no central hub where everyone goes to plan an insurrection, he said. Brookie added, what a lot of this large-scale deplatforming does is limit the ability of these groups to reach new audiences. But, he warned, there may be a cost. Those who are already engaged in these type of online communities are more likely to become more hardened in their convictions. The tourists who believe travel restrictions don't apply to them as pandemic quarantines go, this might be the best. Sprawling on a hotel balcony overlooking azure Caribbean waters as you bake gently in the sun. But it isn't enough for some. The past month has seen a slew of high-profile cases of tourists getting in trouble for breaking the rules while on a sun and sand vacation. In December, Skylar Mack, an American student was jailed for 2 months when she flew to the Cayman Islands instead of quarantining for 2 weeks at her hotel as the law obliged her to do. Popped out 2 days later to attend the jet ski competition in which her boyfriend was competing. In January, former British beauty queen and model Zara Holland and her boyfriend Elliot Love quarantined at her 4-star hotel in Barbados for the required 5 days before taking a second PCR test, as is required for travelers from high-risk countries. So far, so good, except that when Love's second test came back positive rather than face further quarantine, the couple made a dash to the airport to try and catch a flight home. Then there was the British couple, again in Barbados, who tried to spice up self-isolation by inviting a local resident over for sex. She was caught climbing over the hotel fence. And the Jamaican tourist who popped out of his hotel quarantine for a soft drink and has ended up doing jail time. Staying put in the sun seems like the easiest thing anyone's been asked to do so far in the pandemic, so why are people breaking the rules? Switching off whenever people are presented with an extremely frightening scenario. Previous research has shown that they switch off, says clinical psychologist Bhavna Yani Nagandi, who believes that health warnings should be at an optimal level for people to take notice. In the case of, say, the harmful effects of smoking, warnings can be tailored up or down to increase the chance of people taking note. But with regulations that need to be kept at a certain level to protect the local population, it's not possible to beat about the bush. In the pandemic, says Yani Nagandi, facts cannot be tailored. It seems that some people are behaving in a manner that would suggest they are switching off to the facts, believing that it will not happen to them and that only the most vulnerable are at risk. What's more, according to one travel industry expert, the lack of coherency on travel restrictions across the globe doesn't help. Related content: when will international travel return? Here's what we know right now. There's no consistency, and travelers are being badly misled by the fact that there are no global rules, says Paul Charles, Virgin Atlantic's former director of communications, who now runs his own PR consultancy, the PC Agency, and has become something of a thorn in the UK government's side over its regular flip-flopping of travel regulations. Charles has a vested interest in getting the travel industry back up and running, of course, but he believes a global approach, led by the G20 countries, would be the ideal way forward. He says that a global consistent testing program, so that everybody could be tested on departure with high-quality results within 30 minutes, would transform the way we are currently traveling, or not. However, in the meantime, he says, any restrictions have to be enforced for travelers to behave them. I think the rules have to be fully supported by law. In a pandemic, you have to have strict enforcement so you achieve the outcome of lower infection rates and lower deaths, he says. That's perhaps been one of the issues. Governments haven't backed up tougher rules with tougher enforcement. Economies around the world are being ruined because people are breaking the law, meaning tougher measures are being put in place for longer. It only takes one uncaring person. Strict enforcement is exactly what the Cayman Islands are going for. As far back as January 2020, we began planning and preparing for what we expected to be the eventual arrival of the virus on our shores, said Roy Tatum, head of the Office of the Premier, Alden McLaughlin. Early measures included bans on travel from affected countries, and additional screening of arrivals. But despite precautions, the first case of COVID-19 was confirmed in March. In response, the islands closed their borders and implemented a 14-day quarantine in government-controlled facilities for anyone entering the country, as well as implementing lockdowns and curfews, closing schools, and restricting access to care homes, hospitals, prisons, and breaches. The result? As of January 10, just 359 cases and 2 deaths during the entire pandemic. We have sacrificed much since the initial lockdown at the end of March, which has helped eliminate the virus within our local community, says Tatum. Today, people are able to live somewhat normal lives and many businesses have been able to open. The only way the virus is able to reinfect our community is if it arrives on our shores from the outside. Currently, entry to the Cayman Islands is limited to residents and a handful of other people with links to the islands and its residents. But since hundreds of residents were prosecuted and fined for breaking the initial lockdown, there have been just 7 potential quarantine breaches investigated, 2 of which have gone to court. Skylar Mack was visiting her boyfriend, Fanshay Ramjeet, a Cayman Island resident, when she fell foul of the law in November. Allowed in as the partner of a resident, she should have quarantined for 2 weeks. Instead, after just 2 days, she removed the tracking device that was making sure she stayed in one place, and joined her boyfriend at his jet ski event. When police caught up with her, she was found to be not wearing a mask and not social distancing. Her initial sentence of 4 months in jail was halved on appeal in December. Ramjeet received an equal sentence. But despite protestations from her family, who appealed to U.S. President Donald Trump for help, and received a supportive tweet from his son, Eric, the authorities of the Cayman Islands, a self-governing British overseas territory, have not backed down. Should COVID-19 become widespread in our small community, it would be potentially devastating, says Tatum. We are talking about a disease that has the ability to kill people and destroy an economy. That's the reason why anyone who deliberately flouts the important public health laws and regulations of our islands that are in place to protect the wider population should be subject to strict penalties. There also needs to be a deterrent to ensure people understand the seriousness of the virus and the importance of the public health law and regulations. It only takes one careless, uncaring person to move about our community to create serious health issues, including potential death by restarting community transmission. We have a small population and a close community that still treasures and respects our elders, who, as we all know, are very high risk. In addition, if the Cayman Islands had to go back into a lockdown situation, the effect on our local economy, and the impact on our children, elderly and indeed the broader population, would be considerable. You must be held accountable. So far this year, it's Barbados that has hit the headlines for tourists behaving badly, as they flock to the Caribbean. Many of THSE traditional alternative winter sun destinations are out of bounds due to closed borders, which perhaps explains the slew of offenders descending on the region. When Elliot Love, ensconced in the plush beachside Sugar Bay Hotel, tested positive, he and girlfriend Zara Holland cut off their quarantine wristbands and checked out. They caught a taxi to the airport and attempted to board a plane for the 9-hour flight back to the UK, knowing that the new UK variant is thought to be up to 70% more transmissible. They were arrested as they went through security on December 29. Holland was given a $12,000 $5,900 United States dollars fine, instead of a 9-month prison sentence, and was bailed for an undisclosed amount. Love, who was tried several days later, when he was no longer testing positive for the virus, was fined $8,000 $4,000. Neither Holland or the couple's lawyer responded to a request for comment. But they're not the only tourists behaving badly in Barbados. On January 1, Swiss national Ismail El-Bali was fined $6,000 $3,000 United States dollars when he left the hotel where he was quarantining. Having tested positive, El-Bali argued that his wife had received a call confirming a negative test that morning, and assumed it covered both of them. His fine was reduced from $8,000 in light of the circumstances. And on December 31, Jamaican tourist Dean George Scott was jailed for 6 months when he walked out of the hotel where he was quarantining to buy a can of Fanta. In reaction to social media outcry that white tourists were being fined while the only black rulebreaker was jailed, Chief Magistrate Ian Weeks told the court that prison terms were a last resort if paying a fine was not an option. Sure enough, days later, Brits Andrew Luger and Julia Knightley were fined $6,000 US $2,955 each for inviting a resident to their hotel room for sex. During their quarantine period, neither the Barbados Tourist Board nor the government were available to comment on the restrictions. Related content: how a COVID-19 vaccine could change travel for good. However, Acting Chief Medical Officer Dr. Kenneth George has laid the blame for the island's increasing case numbers partially at the door of rule-breaking tourists. And in a video posted to Facebook shortly before Holland's trial, Prime Minister Mia Mottley said, "We are very clear that on those persons who are visiting us, and to the extent that anyone is breaching our protocols, the government of Barbados through the COVID monitoring unit will take the necessary action for any visitors. We believe that by far the majority of them are compliant, but the handful who have chosen to ignore our mores, ignore our customs, ignore our laws and guidelines, you must be held accountable." Why one traveler broke the rules. So what's going on in the heads of people when they break the law when traveling? For one rule breaker, it was merely the idea of seeing how far they could go. The UK resident, who requested to remain anonymous for fear of losing his job, told CNN he travelled from London to Venice for a vacation in June while the UK was still in lockdown and all but essential travel was banned. It was at the end, when lockdown was about to be lifted, and the news was saying how people are booking holidays and everything was getting booked up. "I thought, I want to travel, but not with the crowds when it's still quiet," he says. "I'd seen images of famous landmarks being empty, so it was a once-in-a-lifetime chance." At the time, Italy was allowing travelers from the UK, so he was breaking no rules on arrival, even though he was on departure. "I didn't see it as breaking the rules too much. I was thinking for myself, basically," he says. Italy was more safe at that point than the UK, so by going, Italy was more at risk, but they were the ones with the open borders. He flew via Dublin, which was locked down at the time, but allowing transit passengers. "But I had a couple of hours between flights and out of curiosity wanted to test what happened," he says. So instead of staying in the airport, as he was obliged to do, he went outside, and nobody stopped him. "I was looking for a bus to the city centre to see if there was time to get a Guinness. But there was no shuttle. And with nothing running I didn't want to spend too much money on Ubers." The UK traveller doesn't see his infractions in the same light as those travellers to the Caribbean who he calls bad and irresponsible. But he says that one thing that made him feel comfortable with travelling when he shouldn't was seeing footage of travellers arriving in the UK at the start of lockdown. The UK never closed its borders, and has only recently stopped arrivals from countries exposed to the new South African variant, but when passenger locator forms and then quarantine were introduced, travellers were filmed arriving, clearly unaware of the restrictions. "That's why I felt pretty safe breaking the rules," he says. He also says that on return to the UK's Stansted Airport, he was not asked for his passenger locator form, or told to quarantine for 14 days, as he was obliged to do at that point. He did do so, though says that a couple of days afterward, quarantine restrictions were lifted, so he ventured out. Psychologist Bhavnayani Nagandi says his behavior is understandable. When people see others break the rules, then they could wonder why different rules apply and they might try getting away with it, she says. But for some, arriving in countries where the travel restrictions are enforced by the law may come as a sharp surprise.